Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Belfast City Council, I would like to welcome you to today's event as we remember the Holocaust and subsequent genocides. Tomorrow is the International Day for Remembering the Holocaust, a day set aside each year which provides us with a space to recall all those who suffered unimaginable horrors in the Holocaust and subsequent genocides. Remembering the Holocaust gives us the opportunity each year not only to recall and remember, but to also look at its legacy and its relevance for us in today's society. We should never forget how such events came about. Whilst people have the capacity to perpetrate the most unimaginable horrors, I believe that people also have the capacity to do wonderful acts of kindness. We must encourage and support people to stand up to prejudice and to oppose and expose forms of hatred. I would like to thank Professor James Weller for joining us today from the US as we reflect on the Holocaust. Professor Weller is widely recognised expert in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, and he is certainly no stranger to Belfast. Professor Weller, we are delighted to have you. Could I thank you all who, despite the challenges presented by the current pandemic, have joined this webinar to remember the Holocaust and the victims and survivors of other genocides and atrocities. I will now hand you over to Dr. Katie Redford, who will be chairing this event.
Lord Mayor, thank you very much indeed, and welcome to everybody to this extraordinary event to consider Holocaust. And the challenge this year is to be the light in the darkness. So thank you for adding some light to that darkness. Today's event will be closing at 1:30 promptly, but prior to that we have 50 minutes of Professor James Waller speaking to us from the United States. Professor Waller is absolutely no stranger, as you said, to this part of the world, and knows very well that victims and survivors have much to contribute to the healthiness and healing in shared and contested spaces. I've had the privilege of seeing Professor Waller explain his theories and experiences on the legacy of victimhood and conflict trauma to victims and survivors here, and he's helped to unpack the complex and sometimes interrelated terms, the roles of witnesses, of collaborators, of victims, survivors, and perpetrators. After Professor Waller has spoken, we will have some time for questions and answers. So may I please encourage you to post your questions within here, and we will endeavour to have them all answered in due course. It's very timely that Professor Waller is with us at the moment. We had the awful atrocity earlier on in January of the burning of the Multicultural Association here. And as we grapple with new policies for victims and survivors here, it's very helpful for us to learn from the mistakes of the past. And as Professor Waller says in his latest book, which he will talk to, that there's a stark warning for us all that we remain perilously close to repeating and residing in the mistakes of the past. So may I hand you over to our light in the darkness today, Professor James Waller. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thank you, Dr. Radford, for the kind introduction as well. I'm just going to start my screen share now. It is wonderful to have the chance to be with you. I'm very sorry we can't have the chance to be together in person. As you've heard from the introductions from the Lord Mayor and my good friend, Dr. Radford, Belfast and Northern Ireland have places very close to my heart and very warm to my heart. And I always enjoy the chance to be with you, to be in community with you, to see you, to chat with you about some of the issues that we'll chat about today. So while we can't do that in person, it's a great honor to have a chance to be with you here today. Every morning, I start with my digital subscriptions to the Belfast Telegraph and the Irish News to catch up, to see how things are going, to see what's happening. And I know how much you're suffering through the pandemic and the extended lockdown. I recognize the impact of Brexit and how that's being felt in some ways foreseen, in some ways unforeseen. And I know for you, as it is for everyone around the world, these are difficult times. So for you to take the time today to be with us on the Holocaust Memorial Day, to speak about Holocaust remembrance and the lessons learned, I know I speak for the organizers as well as myself in saying we're deeply, deeply appreciative of you taking that time. We come together on Holocaust Remembrance Day primarily to remember, primarily to commemorate, primarily to think about the loss of life that happened between 1939 to 1945, when the Nazis decided that their final solution to the Jewish problem was the extermination of a people. In that 6-year period, over 6 million Jews, European Jews, lost their lives at the hands of Nazi killing policies and practices. That's 2/3 of Europe's Jews that lost their lives over that 6-year period. I think often, sometimes the number 6 million itself becomes an abstraction. We lose sight of the humanity that lies behind that 6 million. So often when I speak with my students about the Holocaust and about the victims, I often use the phrase 6 million and one to draw their attention to that one, because we know the number was no less than 6 million. It was likely far more. But 6 million and one draws our attention to the one life that was lost, not because of who they were as an individual, but simply because of the group membership they held. And we have to remember that those 6 million lives, and you see these reflected here in some of the images as we start, these 6 million lives were lives of people who had hopes, dreams, and aspirations that would never have a chance to be fulfilled. Again, not because of anything about who they were as an individual, but simply because of the group membership they held. They loved people. They were loved by people. Again, they had hopes, dreams, and ideas for their life that they never would have a chance to fulfill simply because of their group membership, simply because of their social identities. But in addition to remembering and commemorating this loss of life today, part of remembrance, I would argue, is also looking at lessons going forward. In other words, if all we do is remember the past, but not learn from it, we've missed out on the chance to apply some of the lessons learned from the past to the world that we live in and we've inherited today as well. So what I'd like to do in my time with you is to think about 3 questions together. And please, as you come up with questions, we'll be able to get to those at the end of my comments as well. But the 3 questions I want us to look at together are these. First, what is social identity? What do we mean by it? And how is it tied to a deeply divided society? Secondly, how do we assess the risk of violent conflict in a deeply divided society? And thirdly, how do we begin to heal a deeply divided society? I think these questions flow out of our time together today in remembrance and commemoration to ask hard questions, as you see here on the sculpture to the right, of is it possible to make never again a reality? It's only possible to make never again a reality, I would argue, if we come to grips with some of the very difficult questions raised by the Holocaust. So I'll start with a discussion of social identity and how it's tied to a deeply divided society. Anytime you and I are asked the question, who are we? Or we ask ourselves the question, who am I? Some part of the answer to that question is based on who we are as individuals, things very specific and unique to me. But some part of that answer is also based on what we call social identity, or we identity. In other words, part of our understanding of who we are, answering that important question of who am I, comes not just from the notion of who am I uniquely, but also comes from the groups, the social groups that we have tied ourselves to: religion, ethnicity, race, gender, age, wide range of social groups we could think about that we have been born into, are chosen to be part of, and those social groups become a big part of how we answer the question, who am I? Sometimes the social groups we choose to be part of are just really affiliate groups. So some of us get a big part of understanding who am I just from the notion, for instance, of sports teams that we align ourselves with, a football team that we may be a fan of. Their successes become our successes. Their failures become our failures, but our connection with that identity, even though we don't play for the team, the connection with that identity becomes a big part of understanding who we are. So when we ask questions about social identity, these are healthy parts of understanding who we are and answering the question of who am I? These social groups that we've tied ourselves to, these we identities that are emotionally important to us. The difficulty, though, with social identity starts to come into play when we begin to define ourselves, as you see in this quote, not simply by the question of who we are, but also then by the question of who we are not. And social identity can, in some cases, start to divide. So in other words, it's not simply an answer to the question of who am I, but it also becomes an answer to the question of who I'm not. And who I'm not, that division starts to define a large part of how we think about how we live in society. As you see in this graphic, there's a line of connection that unites us to everyone. But one of the things that social identity can do when we become so immersed in it is it can break that line of connection, and it can start to just encircle the people who are like us. So the people who share my important social identity, religion, race, ethnicity, nationality, those people are the people that I feel most connected to. And I start to disconnect myself from people who are the other side of that social identity or don't share that social identity. So social identity, for those of us who work in the field of social psychology, becomes disconcerting when it starts to divide rather than unite, when it starts to shrink and pull ourselves into smaller groups rather than larger groups, when it breaks that line of connection with other people. One of the characteristics of societies that we refer to as deeply divided societies is that these types of social identities, these we identities, become very central to how those identities function. And in those societies, people are defined much more by their differences rather than their similarities. And as you see here, when we think about the centrality of social identity, that can come from class, caste, social hierarchy, faith, communal divides, language, race, ethnicity, nationality, and a wide range of other binary divisions. And again, in most every society, social identity has a role that it plays. And sometimes that can be a pretty healthy role, but sometimes the centrality of it, the focus of on differences rather than similarities becomes so pronounced that it leads to some very deep polarizations of social identity. And we can see these polarizations in communities and countries that have a history of violence, a history of political division, differences in quality of life that lead to communities that live in fear, that live in isolation, that lead to these times of majority and minority conflict. I live in a country, the US, that has a deeply polarized, deeply divided society based on social identity. And for us, that polarization really has centered around, for over 2 centuries, the notion of race and those deeply divided social identities that determine who I identify with racially, who I don't identify with, and those things translate very significantly into differences in quality of life, and they've led to communities of fear and isolation as well. This type of polarization you can see here in this cartoon description of how people in divided societies come to think about themselves and about the other, the people that don't share their social identity. So for my group, the in group, it's our blessed homeland. But I look at the other group who doesn't share my social identity, it's their barbarous waste. It's my glorious leader, their wicked despot, our great religion, their primitive superstition, our noble populace, their backward savages, our heroic adventurers, their brutish invaders. And if you've often heard, even in your own society, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. This is part of the polarization that starts to develop in a deeply divided society where social identities have become not only central, but defining. They're a defining feature that polarizes much of that society. And what we worry about, and large part of what I do in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, is I look at how do we prevent this type of polarization from flaring up into violent conflict. And I work with governments and civil society actors around the world on this question. And one of the things we notice is that the biggest warning sign for us with this polarization is when the other, the person who doesn't share my social identity, starts to be viewed as an existential threat. In other words, a threat to my own existence. And this is important because there are many outgroups that are around us. So a lot of groups that don't share specific social identities that we hold to be important. And we have many more than one social identity that for us is important. So there are a lot of different outgroups in the societies in which we live, but some of those are perceived to pose a greater danger to us, an existential threat to us. And this is one of the warning signs. This is one of the signs of escalation that we worry about in societies that have these deep divisions, is when the other is perceived as an existential threat. Some of those threats are very, very realistic threats. The other is a threat to my economic well-being because the other may be taking jobs that I can no longer have because those jobs have been taken. The other could be even a threat to my physical existence. Maybe the other has made statements or actions that lead me to perceive that that group is intent on the extermination of my group. So many times there are very realistic threats that the other can pose that at least we perceive as realistic, that could be escalating. Sometimes though, the threats that the other poses are more symbolic threats. They're threats to things that have deep meaning to me. So the other may have religious preferences and practices that start to become a threat to my own religious preference and practice. The other may choose, and this has come up certainly often in your society, language can be an intangible threat to my meaning system. That if you don't make room for my language, or if my language is not included in the way the state works and the way the state communicates, that's a threat to my existence as well. Again, not a threat to my physical existence, but a threat to something that has deep meaning to me. So again, all societies are going to have social identities within them. But what we're looking at is what are the situations where the importance of social identity escalates, where it becomes central to how a society works, when it becomes polarizing and sometimes paralyzing to how a society works, and when these social identities start to pose existential threats, where me being me maybe depends on you not being you, not being your language, not being religion, or maybe not even existing physically. When we see these type of escalations, and this is something that we certainly saw through the process of the Holocaust, what it poses then is the possibility for potential violent conflict. Many of you will know the work of Adrian Guelke, who is a prolific scholar at Queen's University in Belfast. And Adrian has been one of the people that has written most frequently and most well-known on the concept of deeply divided societies. And he writes, in a deeply divided society, conflict exists along a well-entrenched fault line that is recurrent and endemic, and that contains potential for violence between the segments. I like that phrase, a well-entrenched fault line, that in a deeply divided society, social identity has worked its way into the fabric. It's needled its way into the fabric of society, and it's always there. And like a fault line, it can be triggered by some event. Something can happen that brings about episodes of violent conflict. I have a friend in Belfast who I was with the last time I was there about a year ago. And at some point in our conversation, he said to me, "You seem very comfortable in Belfast in Northern Ireland." And I said, "You know, I am very comfortable here." And I think in large part that comfort stems from the fact that I see a lot of things in my society that are mirrored in Northern Ireland society. And I think this potential for violent conflict, this is a story both of our societies have shared over our history, that at times these fault lines, these deeply entrenched fault lines have opened up and they've swallowed us in episodes of violence. And for my country, most recently, that was January 6th with the insurrection at the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. But the potential remains because these deep divisions, these deep polarizations really haven't healed. And it goes beyond my country, it goes beyond Northern Ireland, and this has really become for us a global problem. Every year, the Institute for Economics and Peace does an assessment of the state of global peace. And in their most recent one for 2020, you see the countries listed here on the left from less peaceful to more peaceful. And outside of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, one or two Scandinavian countries, most of the world is not rated as more peaceful. And what we've seen, if you look in the graph, is from 2008 to 2020, for 9 of those years, global peacefulness has been in a pretty steady decline. And you look throughout the world and you realize that most of the world is characterized by some level, some disruption of peacefulness. And a lot of these cases, if we went country by country by country, a lot of this lack of peacefulness is based on deep social identity divisions, on deeply divided societies with competing social identities, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever it is, that have driven such a wedge in those societies that it's difficult to picture them and to understand them as very peaceable societies. So some of the social identity divisions that plague the US, that have plagued Northern Ireland, again, we're not alone in this story. These are stories that many countries in the world share today. So the second question that brings me to then is, how do we assess the risk of violent conflict in a deeply divided society? Again, we understand the escalation. We all have social identities. Sometimes social identities become very central to a society. Sometimes they become polarizing. Sometimes they reach that point of existential threat. So what are we really looking for when we're trying to assess and figure out to what degree is this society at risk of violent conflict? It used to be in the field that I work in Holocaust and genocide studies, this was always, when violent conflict broke out, this was always a surprise to us. And this is the black swan metaphor that you see on the slide, that when you see a black swan, it's so unusual, it's so unpredictable, you could just have never seen it coming. And I would say 20, 25 years ago, this is often how we felt about violent conflict, that when it happened in a society, it caught us by surprise. It was unpredictable. We didn't see it coming. It really took us back because it just wasn't on our radar. But I think that today, the much better metaphor for how we understand violent conflict and the risk of it is the gray rhino. We see it coming. We know what the risk signs are. We know what to look for. It's staring us in the face. We can look at a country, we can assess the degree of risk, and we know exactly the types of things that put countries at risk of violent conflict. So today, we don't have the luxury of being able to evade responsibility by saying we didn't see it coming. We didn't know what the warning signs are. We didn't know how much risk was there. We have enough literature, we have enough evidence, we have enough background and data to have a good sense of what puts countries at this type of risk. In 2016, I wrote a book called Confronting Evil, which was about assessing the risk of violent conflict and genocide. And what I did was examine all the models we had of risk assessment for what makes a country fragile, what makes a country unstable, what makes a country volatile in terms of assessing risk. And I placed those factors into 4 categories: governance, conflict history, economic conditions, and social fragmentation. And I want to look briefly at each of these 4, because again, this to me is part of the remembrance that we think about Holocaust Remembrance Day, is that the responses to what was happening in the Holocaust should have come more quickly from the world if we had been aware of the risk that was unfolding. And it unfolded very slowly. From 1933 to 1939, there were a raft of policies that excluded Jews, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. And then in 1939, the killing starts and continues for 6 years. But we could have seen that coming had we paid attention to some of these risk factors. So the first set of risk factors I look at when I ask the question of to what degree this country might be at risk for the potential for violent conflict have to do with the issues of governance. Here I'm looking at things like state legitimacy deficit. How does the population view the legitimacy of the state that controls it? To what degree is there, for instance, the influence of corruption? I think back to a seminar I led in Bosnia-Herzegovina several years ago, and we were working with college-age, university-age students, and we asked them to think about what they saw for themselves in the future in their country. And their only identity they could think of was unemployed. They saw no future. And we asked deeper questions about, well, what about going to university, getting a university degree? Won't that help the potential for unemployment and for employment? And most of the students said, we can't afford it. We can't afford to go to university. University is covered by the state, so we pushed them more on why they could not afford to go. And they said, we can't afford the corruption, because the first day of class, our instructor will say, if you want this grade in this course, this is how much you have to pay. If you want this grade, this is how much you have to pay, and so on. So they were saying that the corruption runs so deep in Bosnia-Herzegovina that it simply prohibited them from taking advantage of the opportunity for a university education. In situations like that, citizens don't look at their state and say, this is a legitimate state. This is legitimate governance. Many governance issues relate to identity-based polar factionalism. And here we're referring to one of the common characteristics of many peace agreements, including the Good Friday Agreement, has been some notion of power sharing governance, that the way we go forward with governance is that there are representatives from 2 different sides of the social identity divide that have the opportunity to govern together. I think today there are many questions about the effectiveness of power sharing governance, because very often it leads to just a gridlock, an inability to get things done. And many people have argued, I think both for Northern Ireland and for Bosnia-Herzegovina, that when power sharing governance is built on social identity, it doesn't tear down the identities, it puts them in concrete. It reinforces those identities, and in many ways can make governance even harder to do in situations like that. One of the biggest things we're concerned about with governance, though, has to do with regime type. And here we know that for the protection of minority rights and the inclusion of most people, if not all people, democracies are the most effective form of governance. Well, one of our concerns globally today is about the decline in democracy around the world. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. I was teaching in Berlin in 1989, 1990. I always point that out just as a matter of, I remember the time and I was there. I'm not meaning to take credit for the fall of the wall whatsoever. Had nothing to do with it. I just happened to be teaching in Berlin at the time. But I remember the excitement of a world as communism started to dismantle. And in place of communist, more authoritarian regimes, we saw democracies being born in country after country after country. And for about a 20-year period, we saw this great rise in democracies and this great rise in freedom that people thought opened the door to a new way of the world learning to work together. Unfortunately, though, for the past 15 years or so, we've seen global declines in democracies. Here you see a infographic from Freedom House that says over the past 14 years, 25 of the 41 established democracies have suffered overall declines in democratic functioning. And you see the United States and United Kingdom as one of those 25 that have suffered these type of democratic backsliding or democratic deconsolidation. So here we've seen compromises in the functioning of government, compromises in the freedom of expression and belief, compromises in the rule of law, and most importantly, we've seen here less protection from minority rights. As these democracies have declined, the very things we hope they protect against. They protect against corruption, they protect religious freedom, they protect academic freedom, they protect equal treatment under the rule of law. Those things have started to come under increasing question in many places around the world. And the issue with this type of democratic backsliding is that it doesn't typically happen overnight. One of the things we see in democratic backsliding is that it happens very slowly. A lot of these protections of democracy start to get peeled back bit by bit by bit, and everyone that's peeled back doesn't feel like it's that big of a thing to us, doesn't feel like it's that big of a deal. But then over time, there's this cumulative effect of democratic backsliding where perhaps one day you realize that what you once thought of as a functioning democracy isn't one any longer. In December 2016, Evan Osnos asked this question: what's that precise moment in the life of a country when tyranny takes hold? It rarely happens in an instant. It arrives like twilight, and at first, the eyes adjust. And again, what he's saying here is that it's like we're outside on a sunny day reading a book. The sun starts to go down, our eyes adjust and adjust and adjust, and we keep reading, but at some point it's completely dark and our eyes can no longer adjust, and that darkness snuck up on us. This is what we see with democratic backsliding. It typically happens slowly. There's a slow, gradual erosion of democracy. And one day we realize that the democracy we took for granted isn't any longer there. In the United States, I think many people have seen these past 4 years under the previous Trump administration as a time of severe democratic backsliding, and it certainly was. But much of the erosion of our democracy had been in place long before Trump came to power. He and his administration simply accelerated that type of democratic backsliding. And again, this has happened often enough across the world: Hungary, Poland, Thailand, any number of countries around the world that we started to be able to see the process by which this occurs. We see leaders who come to power and they create a nationalistic, mythic past. They divide the population into us and them. They weaponize social identity, and they define social identity, whether it's political or religious basis, whatever it is, and they take glory in dividing the population into us and them, just hoping that they get a bigger us than a bigger them so they can remain in power. There's an anti-intellectualism that questions science, that questions reason, maximizing partisan advantage and polarization, elevating people's will over the constitutional checks and balances. I mean, we've just seen this unfold in country after country after country. In many of the Great Lakes countries in the Great Lakes region of Africa, we've seen presidents changing constitutions unilaterally so they can stay in power for life, saying it's the people's will that they do so. And what this has led to, if you look at this global map of democracy, it has led to a retreat of full democracies around the world. Again, you see Canada, some Scandinavian countries, Australia, New Zealand, that still register on 60 different indicators as full democracies. In 2017, for the first time, my country, the US, moved from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. And again, there's nothing about President Biden's inauguration that immediately is going to transition us back to a full democracy. We have a mountain of hard work to do to restore trust and faith in our democratic institutions. Poll after poll after poll here tells us that people of all age groups have lost faith and trust in local democratic institutions, state democratic institutions, and national democratic institutions. But look here at the number of countries around the world who really have no pretense of democracy, who are hybrid regimes, or in many cases, authoritarian regimes. And you'll see that the excitement that we felt with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that's been replaced by a deep fear, a fear that in these countries that are not democratic, minority rights are not protected, freedom of expression is not protected, freedom of religion is not protected, that these become volatile grounds for the potential for violent conflict. I think it's very important, and I try to be careful in the work I do with Northern Ireland to certainly also acknowledge the ways in which my country struggles with many of the issues that many of you feel your country has struggled with as well. So I certainly want to acknowledge the problems we've seen in our country. In November 2020, 2 weeks before our presidential election, I wrote a paper on the escalating risk of mass violence in the US. And in the paper, I predicted that there's been such a disintegration of trust and faith in US democratic institutions that we have a very high risk for mass violence. And again, this was accelerated by the Trump administration, but the guardrails that we had in our democracy have been degraded under years of partisanship, years of polarization, years of political gridlock. And I think, as many of you know, you feel the anger that comes from the reality that your government can't govern, chooses not to govern. Whatever side of the political divide you're on, you feel the frustration and anger from that. And what it leads to is this breakdown, this disintegration of trust and faith in US democratic institutions. And on January 6th, when insurrectionists attacked the US Capitol, killing 5 people, I had never had an experience where I wish I had been wrong about that prediction. But again, it was foreseeable. It was the gray rhino. We had lost so much trust and faith in our democratic institutions that it was clear that a group of people would willingly engage in violence against those type of democratic norms and institutions. A second risk factor that we look at when we try to assess the degree to which a country is at risk for violent conflict is how it has understood its conflict history. Has it had previous conflict, genocides or politicides? Is there a legacy of vengeance or group grievance that exists in the country? Is there some type of past cultural trauma that has been, like most traumas are, relatively unresolved? And here I'm not speaking simply of individuals who've experienced traumas, but of communities who've experienced traumas, of communities who have passed those traumas on through education, through religion, through art, through poetry, through murals, through novels. However it's passed on, we see that type of cultural trauma leaving some fingerprints in terms of risk. In the US, as I was looking at conflict history in the paper I wrote in November, I was concerned about 2 things that we had never dealt with in our troubled past. One is that we're a country founded on the extermination of one people, the extermination of indigenous people who were here before us, who were exterminated simply because they had land that our settlers wanted. Even if there wasn't physical extermination, and there was plenty of physical extermination of the indigenous population here in the US, there was the cultural extermination, as you see in this image of taking children from their families, placing them in boarding schools, punishing them for speaking their native language, making them dress differently, making them worship differently. It was a cultural extermination of the people that was also part of it. So I recognize and acknowledge that our country was founded on the extermination of an indigenous population, and then founded on the enslavement and importation of an African population to work in slavery conditions to develop the economic strength of a new country. The US has never grappled with either of those two realities. We don't tend to teach much about it in our schools. We don't tend to talk much about it in our political discourse and our social discourse. And as I say here, when we're purposefully, and it is very purposeful, when we're blind to the tensions, violence, trauma, grievances, and egregious violations of the past, that blindness will and does directly impact the present. And what happens, I think, when we don't deal effectively with conflict history is that that past keeps intruding into the present, not in a helpful way, not in a constructive way, but in a very destructive way. And it can leave us at increased risk of violence. I think often of you and all my friends in Northern Ireland, because I know this is a centenary year, and you're coming off a decade of commemorations, some of which have helped heal, some of which have increased divisions. But I know the importance, the relevance of 2021. And I know the struggles, and I keep up with the struggles that you're facing with how in this centenary year do you deal with a troubled past that goes back to 1921 and even before 1921. And I know how it can be tempting to almost be purposefully blind to that history and try to imagine a future without having dealt with that troubled past. But I also know that what we've seen across the world as we look at the literature is that any country who's tried to be blind to these troubled past, who have tried to neglect it, who've tried to avoid it, those countries have had very, very difficult times going forward. So it is a necessary part. I know many of you listening are directly involved with the hard work of dealing with the troubled past of Northern Ireland. There's also, thirdly, I think if we look at risk, in addition to governance, in addition to conflict history, we do pay attention to economic conditions. What is the economic strength of a country in general in terms of their economic development? But more importantly, to what degree do we see economic discrimination and economic inequality? I think sometimes people assume that what puts a country at risk for violence is just simply low level of economic development, particularly poverty. That's one piece of the puzzle, but the bigger piece of the puzzle is economic inequality, economic discrimination, that people aren't given the same economic opportunities across the board in a country. So we are very concerned about issues of economic inequality, and this has been particularly exacerbated by the pandemic. The pandemic has, and you felt this in your country, and it's been felt around the world, the pandemic has hurt people who were in the least protected position, who were the most vulnerable, have been the most hurt economically by the pandemic. The pandemic has not been a respecter of persons, but it certainly hasn't had the impact economically equally across the board. It's hurt the people most who were the most vulnerable. And one of the things it showed us is that what happens when we have this type of economic inequality is people who are on the downside of that economic inequality sometimes can resort to violence to try and restore. I mean, they have nothing to lose. They only have to gain because they're starting from almost having nothing, and violence may be an option to get something. But we also see that groups in power, that privileged groups, can also mobilize with violence to preserve that privilege. And I think for me, one of the things that was instructive about the insurrection on January 6th here in the US is that some people were surprised by it because the US is strong economically. And you don't typically see this type of political violence in countries that have a pretty strong, stable economy. But I think what people neglected to see is that a large part of January 6th was about privilege. It was about white people saying, we don't want to lose the privileges of whiteness. It was about Christians saying, we don't want to lose the privilege that Christianity has given us in this country. It was about wealthy people in some degree saying, we don't want to lose the privileges associated with wealth. And one of the famous historians of our civil rights movement in the US once said that really the challenge of civil rights is, can people choose democracy over whiteness? Can they choose democracy over Christianity? Can they choose democracy over privilege? In other words, democracy is going to implicitly mean equality of opportunity, and it will eat away at some of the privileges that people very much want to hold. And then the final category that I look at, in addition to governance, conflict history, economic conditions, is social fragmentation. And this goes back to where we began with talking about deeply divided societies. We worry about societies that have these deep social divisions based on identity, and especially when those social divisions mean unequal access to basic goods and services. And we see this across the world, that your access to basic goods and services, whether it's education, water, safety, housing, healthcare, depends primarily on social identity. Situations like that lead to pretty significant political instability. And when we see this type of social fragmentation, again, it comes from a deep sense that each group is an intractable existential threat to the other. That's the flesh and blood consequence of living in a deeply divided society. And if I could think of all the risk factors we've talked about, what is the most significant one that we pay attention to? I think that it is this issue of threat. That when I do really come to see the other group as a threat to my own existence, that's what has the potential to unleash violence. And again, I'll acknowledge the situation in my own country as we've listened to insurrectionists after January 6th justify why they did what they did. In almost every case, it was some form of, if I didn't do that, they would take away my country. Whoever they is, they would take away my country. They would take away who I was. They would take away my freedom. It was some statement of existential threat. And so sometimes living in a deeply divided society simply means it's the inconvenience of, we don't associate often with the other, but we have what we need because we stay with people like us. But again, over time, that very often leads to the sense of existential threat that can be so problematic for us going forward. So the final question, which is a question I'll just begin with, but I certainly hope is a question you can help me think through in the question and answer, is how do we begin to heal a deeply divided society? I think in some ways people, when they talk about social identity, say, well, we're going to have social identity, so at least what we can do is make the social identities bigger, make them more inclusive. This is what we call a superordinate social identity instead of a subordinate social identity. So I know, for instance, from surveys like the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey and other polls from Lucid Talk and the Detail and so on, that in Northern Ireland, there's some hope that perhaps the superordinate identity of Northern Irish will become the way people think of themselves, rather than Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, Nationalist, that maybe there's a bigger identity that people can develop an allegiance to. And really what we're asking here, and what we're trying to hope for as a first step in healing, is to say, what can we do? What are the smallest things we can start to do to promote inclusion over exclusion? And again, I was able to look briefly at the participant list as people logged on today, and I saw names of many of you I've gotten to know over the years. And you're at the front lines of doing that hard work of saying we have to figure out ways to promote inclusion over exclusion. And I think that's the way we start to heal deeply divided societies. And I'll go back to the Holocaust here to say that one of those important points of healing, when you're promoting inclusion over exclusion, is you're saying that part of the inclusion is promoting and protecting everyone's civil and human rights. The civil rights are the rights you have because you're a citizen of the UK, of Northern Ireland. Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. You don't have to be a citizen anywhere of anything. You have those rights simply because you're human. When we think hard about building inclusive societies, at the heart of that is going to be, how do we promote and protect civil and human rights for all of us, not just for my group, but for all of us? And the warning sign from history, and from the Holocaust specifically, of what happens when we don't do that is captured in the story of Zaman Grodkowski. Zaman Grodkowski was a Jew who was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau was one of 6 Nazi death camps in occupied Poland. If you were sent to a death camp, it was a death sentence. You were sent there to be put to death. And Auschwitz-Birkenau killed about 1.25 to 1.5 million Jews who came to Auschwitz-Birkenau, typically just within days of arrival. One of the few chances for survival is if you were young enough and healthy enough to be drawn out of the selection process and appointed to be a member of the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were prisoner units that the Nazis used to do the messy work of killing. So the Sonderkommando would strip the prisoners, they'd shave the prisoners' heads, they'd delouse the prisoners, they would force prisoners into the gas chambers, they would man the gas chambers. When the killing was done, they would disentangle the bodies. They would search vaginas and rectums for valuables that may have been hidden. They would pull gold out of the teeth of the mouth of the victims, and then they would burn the victims, sometimes in crematoria, sometimes in large open pits. So to be selected for the Sonderkommando meant you were alive, but you were sentenced to this type of work. And many times people in the Sonderkommando found themselves burning the bodies of family members who had come to Auschwitz-Birkenau with them and were selected for extermination. Zaman Grodkowski was one of those people sentenced to this type of work in the Sonderkommando, and he led a revolt that was unsuccessful, October 7th, 1944. He was executed after the revolt, and then years later, his diaries began to find their way to the surface of Auschwitz-Birkenau. They've been buried and hidden. And one of his diaries, he says this: "Come here, you free citizen of the world, whose life is safeguarded by human morality and whose existence is guaranteed through law. I want to tell you how modern criminals and despicable murderers have trampled the morality of life and nullified the postulates of existence." And what Grodkowski is saying to us today in 2021 is he's saying, come here, let me show you what happens when the 2 things you count on, basic human morality and equal protection under the law, when those 2 things are taken away. When human morality is turned upside down and it no longer applies to you, when the rule of law protects everyone else but doesn't protect you, when you don't have the protection of civil and human rights, Grodkowski is saying, come here. I will show you what happens. This place happens. Auschwitz-Birkenau happens. The Holocaust happens. And it's not an alarmist statement. I don't mean at all to be alarmist with this. It's simply a recognition of when we let this slow slide happen of democratic backsliding, when we don't pay attention to the economic issues in our societies, when we don't pay attention to a troubled past, when we don't pay attention to social fragmentation, these things can start to roll back the basic civil and human rights to the point that one day some of us aren't protected by the rule of law as other people are. Some of us aren't protected by human morality as other people are. And that's what can lead to something like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, in this work of promoting and protecting civil and human rights, for many of you, this is your job. I mean, when we think of the Good Relations Unit at the Belfast City Council, it's a large part of what they're doing. But for each of us, it's part of our responsibility. This has become a fairly well-known photograph of a German man by the name of August Landmesser. This is at a naval shipyard in Hamburg, Germany in June 1936. And what's striking about this picture, as you see, is that as this new vessel is launched, every single person in the crowd is given a Nazi salute, except for August Landmesser. Now he has, turns out, originally been a member of the Nazi Party, but he had fallen in love with a Jewish woman, had had his eyes open to what the Nazis were doing. He had begun to choose in his life, excuse me, inclusion over exclusion. And this is a small statement he made on this humid June 13th, 1936 day to say, everyone around me is doing this. And I know how exclusive it is, but I'm going to choose not to do it. I'm going to choose inclusion over exclusion. I'm going to choose civil and human rights over the taking away, the removal of civil and human rights. And I think of this image often because it reminds us that every day, and I think my challenge for us today, for me and for you, is to say, what can we do today? It's not, don't think about big policies and government and so on, but what can you and I do today that promotes inclusion over exclusion in our communities, in the places we work, in the people we spend time with? If you're interested in more information about some of what I've talked about during my comments, this is the piece I referred to that I wrote in November, early November 2020. I didn't know if I was going to be seen again, the escalating risk of mass violence in the US. If you simply Google this, it's a free of charge publication that you can easily download, and you can get some sense of how I was thinking about the issues of governance, conflict history, economic conditions, and social fragmentations, and explaining the risk of mass violence in the US. And then finally, I'm very excited to say that on March 9th, just over a month from now, my newest book will be released from Oxford University Press, entitled A Troubled Sleep, Risk and Resilience in Contemporary Northern Ireland. This book is a result of my sabbatical at Queen's University and the George Mitchell Institute at Queen's during 2017, and over 100 and some hours of interviews I did with people throughout Northern Ireland, including many of you at the talk today, to think about issues of risk and resilience in contemporary Northern Ireland. And I'm very pleased to have had Senator George Mitchell agreed to write the foreword for the book, and I'm very excited for its release in March, and certainly see it as part of the first step in continuing the conversations that I've been fortunate to have with many people across Northern Ireland. So thank you very much for your time, for your attention, for taking the time to be with us today, and I'll look forward now to our question and answer session. Thank you.
Professor Waller, thank you so very much indeed. That was a wonderful talk, and we have a number of questions and answers, questions coming from the audience, and a number of statements as well. So what I'm going to do with your agreement is to pose as many of those as we can as possible. We have a few minutes to do so. For those of you whose questions aren't answered, forgive me. It's not intentional to exclude anybody. And I will start with a couple of comments that people have made rather than questions. The first coming from Africa House, who was saying this is really interesting, really appreciate this talk, but how important it is to ensure that there is no selective history of the white world in the work that we do. There's also a number of other questions in terms of exact numbers of human beings who were killed during the 37 and 45 period. And again, I know that you're not in a position necessarily to answer those directly, but if you feel you want to speak to that, I know that, that Peter will be pleased to hear from you. But let me first of all go to the first question, and again we will come through these in order that they were put up. Your latest book is Insight into the Politics of Democracy and What Prevails When Democracy Doesn't. Could you speak to the lessons applied here in relation to intergenerational legacy and a predisposition to radicalization?
Thank you, Katie, for that question, and thanks to all of you for your questions and insights you've shared as well. I think one of the issues related to some of the generational legacies, as I think about the material I worked with in A Troubled Sleep, has to do with and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation, but just the transmission of trauma. I mean, we know we do quite a bit of work with psychological trauma at the individual level and the rates of PTSD. And I know that Northern Ireland has a very high proportionate rate of people who still suffer individually from levels of PTSD related to the Troubles. But there's also this, I think, sense of collective trauma that's more at the cultural trauma that's more at a collective level, that's transmitted, as I said, through education, through art, through murals, through story, through memory, that even for people who haven't been directly victimized by the trauma of the Troubles, the trauma is passed on in some very significant ways that ends up having a very similar impact as if they had actually been directly victimized. And I think when I think of cultural trauma as a risk factor throughout post-conflict countries around the world, its impact on how we perceive threat, how we perceive fear, how we perceive being excluded, and just the hypersensitivity and the hypervigilance it leads to in terms of how we react to other people. And I think as a risk factor, one of the things most concerning about it is the ways in which cultural trauma can leave a legacy of a desire for revenge, that things have to be, even though I didn't live through that time, that what's been passed down to me has clearly communicated that revenge is necessary. Vengeance has to be necessary, and that's part of the legacy of some of this trauma that's passed down as well. And we see the impact of unresolved trauma in this way. We see the impact certainly in the US and Native American communities of unresolved trauma. We're seeing in Rwanda following the 1994 genocide, these legacies of vengeance that just continue to be stoked in generation after generation after generation. And it becomes part of that inability to deal with a troubled past.
So that leads me on to the first question from Leslie Stock, who said, over here, many people say, just move on, don't look back anymore. And he's asking you directly, do you think it's necessary not just to remember the victims, but also to remember the atrocities that were committed?
Thank you, Leslie, for that question. There is a line of thought that says the best way for a society to move forward after violence is to draw a line, just move on, pretend it hasn't happened, and just go forward. And I understand that from the standpoint that we get tired of dealing with the past. There's a fatigue to it. But there's absolutely no evidence we have to suggest that that's the best way to move forward. That the past is going to intrude in the present. Even if you want to draw that line and pretend it doesn't exist, it's going to find its way back into the present. So as hard as the work is, I do believe it's absolutely necessary to remember the victims, I do believe it's absolutely necessary to remember the atrocities. I do believe it's absolutely necessary to do whatever can be done to unpack that past and its impact on the present. Some part of it is always going to be contested, but even in the contestation, it can be done in ways that can be very constructive and very healthy for people moving forward. I'll give you one example just from my own experience. I'm a child of the South, the American South. I was born in Georgia. I had never heard our conflict, our war from 1861 to 1865 called the Civil War. I'd always heard it called the War of Northern Aggression because I was a Southerner, and it was about what the Northern people did to us. When I went to university and heard it called the Civil War, I was shocked. I'd never heard of this thing. I never knew there was another side to this story other than what the bad people in the North did to the good people of us in the South and our heritage and our culture and our tradition. So in unpacking that painful past, even the things that are contested are things that help us move forward. So I think the past is never where we think we left it. It's always going to find its way back to us. And again, I understand the fatigue of dealing with it, but I absolutely think it's necessary for post-conflict societies to find a way forward.
Thank you. And I think we can maybe go on to think a little bit about traumatization and re-traumatization in due course with some of the other questions. Denise Hughes from Northern Ireland Alternatives asks, what are the consequences of division around the very notion of a victim? We're categorizing into camps of innocent and non-innocent victims, and she asks, what are the consequences of this?
Yeah, these are the politics of victimhood and victimization you're well familiar with in Northern Ireland. And I can say from a comparative perspective, this happens in every conflict, post-conflict society, are the discussions about who is a victim, how are victims defined, is it preferable to call someone a victim or a survivor, is it victim survivors? What happens when you categorize people into victims? What happens to the narrative? Who's excluded from that? And Denise, I think your question, particularly on Holocaust Remembrance Day, this is something that often comes up in Holocaust studies. Holocaust Remembrance Day is rightly so about 6 million Jews who perished at the hands of Nazi policies and practices of destruction. But there were millions of other people as well. Sinti, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political opponents who also perished at the hands of the Nazi policies and practices of destruction, who sometimes feel like they're not included as victims because the Holocaust is meant to focus specifically on the destruction of Europe's Jews. And so you start to see a hierarchy of victimization, both within the Holocaust and other cases of genocide, that start to make some people feel as if their victimness isn't recognized to the degree that it should be. So I think any discussion of who victims are, who survivors are of necessity going to fall into this. And I think many times, and I work often with perpetrators, and there are many cases where perpetrators of violence want to have themselves included as victims as well for what they perceive as, I didn't have the range of choice to do anything other than perpetrate this type of violence. And I think that starts to stretch the conception of victimhood, I think, far too broadly. And in that, it does become a re-victimization of people who have been truly victims. But even the discussion of what's an innocent victim and a non-innocent victim, all of those things, as painful as those discussions are, I still think, as I said to the question previously, they're absolutely necessary questions for us to have and discussions for us to have as we move forward. Thank you, Denise.
They're hard conversations, but we need to be old enough now and brave enough to have those conversations, I would suggest. thank you for shedding some light into that. As I said, some of the questions that we have are coming through as anonymous. Do please feel free to keep posting. We have a number still to go. If you wish to come through and identify yourself, it's very welcome. But it's also understandable if you wish to stay anonymous. The next one I have is from John Burrows. John asks if you would please, Professor Waller, clarify what you meant with your reference to Christians' role in the violence on the 6th of January. He suggested that it would be offensive to many people and offers you the opportunity to explain a little more by what you mean, suggesting that there may not be evidence that Christians were involved in the violence with the intention of preserving their faith.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the question, appreciate the chance to clarify, and certainly don't mean to be offensive with it. I don't think there's any evidence that people who identified as clergy, as mainstream Christians, were at the front lines of the violence. Were there people in the violence of January 6th who were members of Christian churches? Absolutely so. Were there people who were ordained ministers of some type in extremist groups? Absolutely so. I think what we have a difficult time teasing out in the US is this notion of Christian nationalism, where Christianity becomes involved and intertwined with nationalism in such a way that it is captured in the sense of, this is a Christian country, and anyone who is not Christian doesn't have really the privilege that Christians ought to have in a Christian country. So when I said that the choice is Christianity or democracy, what I mean by that, John, is that in a truly democratic system and society, religious freedom and expression is going to be one of the hallmarks of that democracy. And I think one of the things we struggle with in the US is the presumption that Christianity is the privileged religion. It's the religion the country was founded on, that we are, for however it's defined, a quote unquote Christian country. And in those type of statements, we're immediately then excluding other religions who are a significant, vital part of our country as well. So one of the difficulties, and we're going to be autopsying January 6th for quite some time, is that there was absolutely a strong thread of Christian nationalism. Now, it may be easy for you and I to say, well, those aren't real Christians the way we define them. But in their self-definition, part of their deep sense of nationalism is based on Christian identity. And that people who don't share that Christian identity should not enjoy the same privileges in this Christian country that they enjoy as Christians. And it's the threat to having that Christian identity compromised. So when someone says, why do we have "in God we trust" on our coins? That feels exclusive. That's a symbolic threat to many people who want to say the Christian identity is at the heart of who this country is and how the country was founded. And we still see it work we swear oaths of allegiance on Bibles, and President Biden's inaugurated, sworn in on a Bible. I mean, you see the ways in which Christianity has certainly enmeshed itself in many of our cultural practices, but I think it can be a challenge to a fully mature democracy in that way. So I hope that we may still disagree on that, John, but I hope at least it's less offensive than it came across the first time.
I'm not sure that he said it was offensive, but I think he was concerned it may cause offence. So we're not in communication here, but that was what I took from it. And John, I would add to what Professor Waller has suggested with another recommendation that you do try his new book. It's a very timely book, and it will appeal to anybody who's particularly interested in symbolic traditions and cultural practices that are both real and uncertain at the same time. I do think that it's worth a little plug there, Professor Waller, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Gary.
Brian McGee has asked a particular question, asking whether it's realistic for people to see themselves as Northern Irish in order to achieve inclusion here. Now, that's a particularly specific question, and I think some of these questions may be things that you want to go ahead on, or alternatively have some time to think about. But over to you.
Yeah. No, I always wish I had more time to think about it because I sound less stupid if I can think more time about it. But Brian, that really is a question less for me to answer and more for you and people in Northern Ireland to answer. I have found it when I was doing the research for A Troubled Sleep. I did find it incredibly interesting, the number of commentators who put stock in the notion that, you know, in surveys as the people who identified themselves as Northern Irish kept increasing, that they saw some hope in that. Some commentators said, no, those are just, you know, people using Northern Irish to be synonymous with Unionist or Protestant or whatever. I do think what we know from the literature is that one of the ways divided societies heal is they do have a superordinate identity that starts to define them more than subordinate. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean you give away the subordinate identities, but it simply means there's a superordinate overarching identity that is the unifying one. It's the unifying umbrella of all these subordinate identities. And some nation states have found that superordinate identity to be a statement of nationality. National identity. So I think it's been interesting for me to see people putting hope in the sense that Northern Irish may become a more important qualifier than Unionist, than Nationalist, than Protestant and Catholic, that may become the more important identity. Again, I think the polling data indicate that we don't really know what people are responding to when they say they choose to be Northern Irish. In other words, what does that mean in their mind? But there's certainly precedent that some type of superordinate national identity could be a way of helping heal some of the divisions in a deeply divided society.
Thank you so much. Leslie Stock has come in with a second question, which I'm going to put up now. She, forgive me, I'm not sure of your gender, Leslie. They are asking, how do Palestinians view the Holocaust, given the challenges facing Israelis and Palestinians re-warring at the moment now?
I'm glad the questions are getting more difficult as we go on. It's a good question, Leslie. I've been to Israel a couple of times. I have not spent a ton of time in the occupied areas. I think Palestinians I think the question has two levels. As a historical case, I doubt there's very little room for any group of people to deny the reality of the Holocaust. I mean, the evidence of it, the documentation of it, the history of it is as well established as anything else we have in the world. I think Palestinians view the Holocaust as weaponized politically by the state of Israel to justify policies that Palestinians would view, and many people in the world view, as human rights abuses or human rights limitations. So I think the view of the Holocaust for Palestinians is it has become so politicized, and Israel uses it as a weapon to justify some of the policies, discriminatory and human rights abusive policies they have against Palestinians. So I think in that sense, Palestinians feel that the world is slow to respond to their plight because the Holocaust can be used almost as a cudgel for Israel to say, whatever we do here is the right thing to do, because after all, we almost were wiped off the face of the earth and no one stepped up to help. Few people stepped up to help on our behalf. And I do think we have to be careful about weaponizing any case of suffering in our political, social, and cultural histories. And I think for Palestinians, again, in my limited interactions, I've never spoken with a Palestinian who just denied the Holocaust ever occurred. I know those Holocaust denial themes are out there, but I think generally the difficulties they face with the Holocaust are how it's used to justify what they perceive as discriminatory practices against Palestinians and occupation of lands that are Palestinian lands. And it reminds us, Leslie, and then we'll get to the next question. This is part of why the Holocaust still matters so much today, because it finds its way into the geopolitical landscape in so many fascinating ways.
Thank you very much, Professor Waller. And I guess there's an anonymous question which perhaps links onto that a little, which is, what role do you think Northern Ireland's small Jewish community can play in healing division here?
Katie, you're probably much better positioned than I to answer that question as part of that community. But I had the privilege of being with Katie a year or so ago at the Belfast Synagogue and seeing some of the important work that was happening there to bring together people from both sides of the sectarian divide in some very creative ways and artistic ways as well. I think in divided societies where the divisions are binary, Protestant, Catholic, Black, white, and so on, there's always the question of, what about those small groups that aren't included in those binary divisions? Do they have a role that can be played as peace builders? And I think they absolutely do. It's hard in a binary society where the divisions are so clearly this and this, for these other groups to find their voices politically, whether they be Jewish, whether they be LGBTI, whether they be immigrant communities. And I know there are an increasing number of immigrant communities in Northern Ireland. But again, for them to find voice in political and social structures that are so heavily this or that has been a difficult thing to do. I think if we can be creative about finding ways to open spaces for voices for those communities, it can certainly help stretch our understanding of who is us and who is them, and our understanding of really the diversity of a community that goes far beyond simply these two binary categories.
Thank you very much for that. And I think it's only right that I should just bring to your attention as well, there are a number of comments coming in from Africa House and a range of other organisations connected to BLM, just thanking and being concerned about the narrative that comes through, but thanking you as well for your input. A question from Jeremy Adams here in relation to the good work that's being done by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm wondering about the curriculum for schools, both here and elsewhere, in terms of Holocaust being included in that and other genocides.
I think that's a very important piece of education. Here in the United States, our education system is done state by state by state. And I think now we have, forgive me if the number's not exact, but I think we have at least a dozen states, if not more, where Holocaust and genocide education is a mandatory part of the educational curriculum. I'm the Department of Education appointee for the state of New Hampshire to a Holocaust and Genocide Education Commission that's meeting. Actually, I have a meeting tomorrow. We've been meeting for a couple of months, and it's our mandate is to include Holocaust and genocide education in the state mandated curriculum. Private schools may not have to do it, but any schools that receive state funding would have to address Holocaust genocide education. I think it incredibly important, not simply from a historical standpoint, but really in part of how we've talked about today, from the standpoint of what we can learn from the past about those lessons for today. So I think Holocaust and genocide education, for me, and again, I work in this field, so I'm certainly biased, this is an important part of civic education, of understanding what happens when we don't elevate inclusion over exclusion, what happens when we don't promote and protect civil and human rights. So I do think, I do encourage this to be part of educational curriculum. I'm involved with colleagues around the world and countries around the world who are trying to make Holocaust and genocide education part of their national curriculum as well. Again, to go back to, I think, Leslie's question, it runs the risk of being politicized, and we have to be very careful about that. But the lessons to be gained from it, I think, would be an indispensable part of an educational curriculum.
Thank you very much indeed. And that sort of leads us into an anonymous attendee who's come up with a question. What do you say to people who argue that Holocaust is over-remembered and that it obscures other tragedies of other groups. And I think you started to answer that already. But perhaps if you'd just like to that is our penultimate question. So if you would kind of
No, I appreciate the question. I don't think it's possible for the Holocaust to be over-remembered. I don't think it's possible for the Rwandan genocide to be over-remembered, or the Cambodian or Bosnia-Herzegovina. But really the heart of your question is it standing relative to other cases of genocide? And it's a fair question. We often in the field talk about, and I work in the Department of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So we have the Holocaust and all the other genocides. And within the field itself, there is certainly some dissension and controversy over the perception that there's the Holocaust and then all other forms of suffering, all other forms of genocide. And we have to work hard in the field, and I certainly work hard in my work to make sure that we don't have that hierarchy of suffering. I've had the privilege of speaking with many survivors of genocide around the world, and I know the stories of their suffering are no less than or greater than the stories of other people's suffering. Suffering is suffering, however it happens, wherever it happens. And we have to be very careful not to make a hierarchy of that suffering. And when we pull apart the Holocaust as unique, I think there are dangers in that. We have to understand the Holocaust as a prototypical case study of genocides that have come before and genocides that have come after. And I think, and I'll close with this quickly, that, you know, I was having a discussion with a friend who survived the Rwandan genocide over Zoom just fairly recently. And this question came up about, you know, why is the Holocaust received such prominence among people and such prominence in media and so on, and the Rwandan genocide doesn't, and what does it mean about our suffering? And I just remember the tears. I mean, just the tears he was shedding at the sense of somehow my suffering is less than, because it's not remembered as much, or it's not remembered on the same level. And that was so painful for me to see and so painful for me to hear. And it just reminded me how careful we have to be about those hierarchies of victimization that we tend to so naturally seem to fall into. So really for me, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the Lord Mayor, I think, set this up very well in the beginning. He said, it is about the remembrance of Holocaust and other cases of genocide and mass atrocity. And the fact that we don't name those today doesn't make those any less important for us to remember.
We have one last question for you here, and I do need to close on time, regrettably. I think we could be going on for a long time on this one, but I just wanted to ask you, if we are acclimatized to trauma here, what are the risks that we have that we either promote inertia or avoidance because we are so cautious about re-traumatizing folk, whether that's as an individual or as a policymaker?
It's a great question, Katie. I think it is wise to be cautious about the re-traumatization and re-victimization. That's important. But the presumption of avoidance has to be challenged. And I think, and again, I lived in Northern Ireland for several months, visit often. So all know far better than me how the society works in its unspoken ways. But I think the presumption of avoidance, that how we deal with it is to avoid it and is to put ourselves in silos, that is what has to be challenged. Because the presumption of avoidance and keeping ourselves in silos and keeping ourselves in the communities that we're most comfortable in, it may be comfortable, but long term, it's not doing what we need to do to move a society forward. So while the fear of re-traumatization is real, I think we also have to embrace the recognition that the best education, the best peace building comes in those zones of discomfort where we feel a little uncomfortable and we've stretched ourselves a little bit. That's where we learn. That's where we develop. That's where we grow. So I hope today, and I'll turn it to Katie for the conclusion, but My final word, I hope today, has been a bit of that zone of discomfort for you. And I thank you for sharing the time with me. And again, I very, very much look forward to the next time I can have a chance to be with you in person in Belfast. So thank you very much. Katie?
Professor James Waller, you are a true friend to us. You are a true friend to victims and survivors. And we really appreciate the time that you've given us today to think about Holocaust, Shoah, and other genocides elsewhere. Thank you so very much indeed. And thank you, and I'm sure you'll join with me thanking the Lord Mayor and the Good Relations Department from Belfast City Council and ND Events. Thank you and farewell.
Thank you.